Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to talk about how prostitution is every woman's business. One of the central things that I'll be talking about is how, in the minds of many men who use, be it brothels or strip clubs or porn, every woman potentially is a woman who could be in the trade, who could be solicited for sex, for nude photos. So the title is both referencing the thinking of a lot of men, and it's about how I think it's unfair and inaccurate to say if you're not currently in the sex trade, or at least you have been in the past, then discussing it's none of your business. It doesn't affect you. Let consenting adults do what they want to do, aside from the fact that consenting adults is an extremely simplified view of the sex trade. Thinking that it doesn't affect women who aren't currently in the trade is extremely naive. There are multiple factors, some more obvious, some less so, on how the sex trade affects all women and girls in society. And I'm just going to go through them one by one. The most obvious one is the subject of STIs. And I know it's contentious because historically, women in the sex trade are branded as disease carriers, and they are forced to undergo medical exams. They're imprisoned when they're accused of spreading them, and we don't want to feed into that history of viewing women, as disease or even as death bringers. STIs are, primarily their reality for the women in the industry. That's why every, sex work workplace advice tells her how to minimize her risk of exposure. The thing is, we do have to have that conversation. We just need to reframe it as in, who is the agent? Who is the person who visits the woman in the sex trade and then goes home and has sex with his wife, both without a condom? Or, even oral sex without a condom can spread STIs. So it's been cruelly twisted in the past, but prostitution in that sense is a public health matter. It's not obviously the only way that STIs spread, but it's also wrong to pretend like that doesn't happen at all. Any woman whose one-night stand, boyfriend, husband of 20 years, father of her kids, whoever he is, comes home and gives her an STI because he paid to use the woman in the sex trade, then that is her business. She has a right to be upset about that, aside from, which is the next point, the betrayal trauma that women in those situations experience, especially if it's a long-term partner. We further the Madonna whore divide when we talk about, the stupid wife at home. There's a mentality among some people in the pro-prostitution movement that, women who are married got the short end of the stick, and the sex trade is really the better place to be. And women in the sex trade know who men really are, and women who marry them and date them and have sex for free are really stupid. It is true that there are wives who get cheated on who then develop an irrational hatred of the woman in the sex trade, who are like, she's a devious seductress who led my man astray. There's a sort of blame game going on where the wife at home blames the woman in prostitution, and the woman in prostitution thinks, some, not all will do this, thinks the wife at home, is kind of stupid. Why did she marry someone so idiotic? So women end up blaming each other, and the man gets off scot-free. The man who pays for prostitution often does traumatize the woman in the sex trade and the one at home. Because, betrayal trauma is not a joke. It can make it really hard to have another relationship. This is like something the betrayed wife and the women in the sex trade share. A lot of women who come out of the sex trade and really, really don't trust men for very good reasons. Both of these groups of women can severely struggle to form new relationships, to feel at home in their bodies, to feel at home in their sexuality, to feel like they're not just performing, because that's the next thing why prostitution is everyone's business. Yes, some men make that distinction. There's the wife at home, and I'll do certain things with her, but not others. And then there's the woman in the brothel. And whatever I want to do that I think the wife's not fit for whatever reason, I'll do with the woman in the brothel. But not all men make that distinction. And of course, in reality, the lines are very blurry, and we're not truly two separate categories. And we are all demeaned, and none of us are three-dimensional in the minds of these men. So they will go home and reenact. Obviously, there's the porn pandemic that affects literally all of us, that affects teenage girls having their first sexual experiences, where men reenact things they've seen in porn. Like at this point we don't have to debate that. That's a mass phenomenon. And it is to the detriment of women and girls. It's not just that it's focused on men's pleasure, it also teaches men that pleasure derives from domination, disrespect. It's not like sexual violence didn't exist before porn, but it was normalization of brutal acts, like, for example, extremely brutal anal sex or ejaculating on women's faces or calling them slurs during, beating, choking, all these things. Nobody can tell me that women who aren't in the sex trade don't get to talk about those ripple effects. They have led to significant trauma. At the same time, I realized that women in the sex trade bear the brunt, because any brutal trend that comes up in porn that seems, again, maybe possibly some men think it's too extreme for the woman at home or the woman on Tinder, it's not too brutal for the woman in the brothel, because in his mind she's just a sex machine. But in the end, we kind of all are. Yeah, the same thing happens that a man learns certain things in a brothel. He learns to eroticize, women in a certain get-up, for example. So there are a bunch of women who say before they found out that their husbands or partners were cheating on them, they were asking for weird sexual things, and they were asking for her to put on certain types of clothes that they didn't use before, because, again, in case that wasn't clear, a lot of men who use the sex trade are in partnerships, and it's not like they're not having sex with those partners. And it's also not like they're not asking them to replay whatever fetish it is, that he also pays for. That's a significant ripple effect. The sexual norms that men learn from the sex trade, and I'm really, really not taking the perspective like the woman in the sex trade, she is deteriorating the man somehow, because the sex trade is not built on sexual practices that women made up. Otherwise, men wouldn't be paying. Men pay so that women endure and fake enjoyment of really often painful and degrading acts. So possibly all those things are quite, I don't know, are they well known? You tell me. There is the risk of infection. That's not a joke, and that's not just a moral panic. That is a real thing that happens. Women have a right to talk about that. There is the betrayal trauma, and there's the changed sexual expectations. All of these are really significant. But if you need additional evidence for what I just talked about, like if it's not enough, then let me talk to you about the Twitter poll when I asked women how many of you have been asked if you would do, paid sex, porn, stripping. Especially in societies where prostitution is legal, and especially in red light districts, but not just there. It literally comes into your private home. It's everywhere. Women get harassed for this. Each and every one of us is a potential prostitute in the minds of some men. Sadly, a significant number of men. And that is not the same thing as being asked, would you do a haircut or a massage, which is definitely inappropriate if you don't know someone, because in that moment, they're saying, yeah, would you want to be a sex toy? I think that's the moment where everyone intuitively gets what the sex trade is actually about and why it is dehumanizing. I'm going to go through the results of my Twitter poll because I feel it makes it a lot less abstract what's going on. I'm not going to read out individual women's stories. They are public. You can go on a thread and read them, but I am just doing a summary. For 1 week, I polled my female Twitter followers for how many of them have been harassed to sell sex or to do porn or stripping. And more than 1,200 replied to the poll, and about 100 told their individual stories. And here's what they had to say. Out of 1,281 respondents, 63% had been harassed in this manner. Out of the total number of respondents, 40, it happened multiple times. Now, I'm completely aware that my Twitter poll is not representative, because those are women who are feminists, who are probably already critical of the sex trade. So women who have had these kinds of experiences would probably be overrepresented in that sample. It's also women from lots of different countries, but mostly, English-speaking Twitter. And of course, it'll be interesting to do an actual study and have it broken down by country, by region. Does it actually happen more to women where prostitution is legal? Presumably, yes. But as one Twitter follower pointed out who experienced this a lot in the Middle East, it's completely possible to be in a country with prohibition, or like the US with prohibition, that, prides itself on either Christian or Muslim sexual morals, but then in practice lives, in complete hypocrisy. So what were women harassed for? Out of those who specified, 73% were harassed for prostitution, 23% for porn, and that covers just nude photos, nude photo shoots, camming, OnlyFans, and just regular pornography. And then about 4% were harassed to do stripping. So when it comes to when women were harassed, I can't give you percentages exactly because a number didn't specify the age they were at. I would presume, though, from the evidence that a lot of women were younger. A lot of them said it happened to me when I was younger, but now that I'm middle-aged or older, it doesn't happen so much anymore. And that's not surprising because the prostituted population is, mostly between like 20 and 30 years old. Yeah, most of the women who specified their age said they were young. And a lot of them said how they might have been, 23, but they still looked 17. There was a really significant number who talked about how this happened to them when they were children. And the average age of those respondents was about 14 and a half years old. With, again, many of them saying, but I wasn't wearing makeup. I definitely look younger. And that's another thing that a lot of women said. It's certainly not that I was wearing high heels and a skirt, not that that justifies it, but people have this image of, just don't go to the bad part of town in your party clothes, and then it's not going to happen to you. And plenty of women were like, I was in a thick coat, I was in a winter jacket. No indication other than being female and young and walking about. Which brings us to, where did the harassment happen? Most of this, as it was specified, was public and outdoors, including in broad daylight, certainly not just at night. So a lot of it just happened on the street, just walking down the street, and a man comes up to you, or very often it's a curb crawler and he's slowing down in his car and is like, what's your price? Or for how much would you do X, Y, sex act? Happened repeatedly at bus stops, right? So a woman or a girl, sometimes in her school uniform, waiting at a bus stop, and the car slows down and she's propositioned, because we don't have strong enough words for these things that men do, including, to girls. Parks, women just reading a book in a park, one woman said, like women just minding their own business. When a man just comes up and makes a proposal. There are a number of stories. I wasn't sure where to class that, if that's indoors or outdoors. Women in taxis. There were multiple stories of taxi drivers saying, if you can't pay, you can pay me in another way. This also happened to a friend of mine who disclosed to the taxi driver that she wasn't sure how she could keep paying for a hostel when she was homeless. And he said, well, one way would be if, I come up to the room with you. So those of you who wonder, like, why do some women prefer a female-only taxi service? This is why. There are stories of festivals and parties, and a bunch that happen, publicly, but indoors. Again, during the day, some women were like doing their groceries. Other women were just drinking at a cafe during the day, or a restaurant, or, on holiday, just chilling. Now the woman was just on the beach, just chilling. Who goes up to a random woman on the beach asking for prostitution? Well, Johns do. Maybe less surprisingly, it does happen, of course, at bars and in clubs. And we do know that these are places where prostitution might take place, but still, women have a right to go to bars and clubs and not be asked how much for your pussy. And hotel and hostels, including by men who ran them. So I guess there's another huge thing that I didn't specify in my question, otherwise I probably would have gotten more replies, and that is when a landlord, or in this example that one woman specified, a hostel owner asks her, if you can't pay for your room, you can pay me in another way, threatens to kick her out unless she does that. And that has happened so many times, including to myself. When I was really desperate looking for a place to stay in a big city, I put up a profile. You can offer yourself as a landlord, but you can also offer yourself as a tenant. Just say, I'm a student, I'm doing X, Y, I'm blah, blah, blah. Introduce yourself. I'm obviously clean, no pets, no kids, no smoking. Every time I did that, I was propositioned by landlords to prostitute myself to them in exchange for a place to live in an expensive big city. And this is a complete global plague. And it is, as far as I know, not legal, but if you believe sex work is work, then it's not a stretch that under that ideology, such an arrangement could be considered, a form of sex work. But clearly it's exploitation. To me, it just doesn't make sense to say, If she has to have sex in a brothel to pay her rent, then it's not exploitative. But if she has to have sex with the landlord, then it is exploitative. I don't really see how that is one of those is less exploitative. Okay, but I'm getting off topic. We were talking about women who are not in the sex trade. A huge number of women experience this in the context of work or at university, where someone came up to them. So they're clearly in either studying or in a professional role. Like they have the, outfit from the place of work. This can include like completely regular shops, not just bars at night, though that does of course happen. Of course, there is online solicitation for prostitution, and this can happen to anyone. And it's since I started showing my face online, it's definitely happening to me more that men write me messages, and not just, hey pretty, hey cutie, blah, 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 can I meet you? But also, would you do X, Y? And sometimes, slapping a price on it. So this online grooming definitely happens to a lot of girls when someone offers them, however many dollars, euros for a nude picture, which is how some girls, later women, slide into the sex trade. And then actually a minority of cases the women reported was happening in a red light district. So not most. It's not like if we avoid the bad part of town, it doesn't happen. It can even happen in your own home. That's sort of the last category. Women said, I was at a friend's house, or it was at my home, and I thought this was a trusted person, and they weren't. It happens in red light districts. That's less surprising, but still, it's not contained to the brothel. It certainly spills out onto the street, but then it also spills out into, like I told you, like it could happen anywhere, in your own home, while grocery shopping, while at university or school or your work, while at a restaurant, at a bar, can happen anywhere. Which brings us to highlighting the perpetrators who was doing this harassment. And I broke this down by statistics. This is based on 114 incidents by 89 respondents. It was about 60% strangers. So mostly men that the women didn't know, which is not surprising because men know that this is a form of harassment. And at least this would indicate most would not do this to a woman they know. They would do it to a stranger. But then about 10% were friends or friends of friends, someone in your circle, someone whom she potentially trusted, who knows she's strapped for cash, or who, realizes she wouldn't want to date him, but maybe he can get something in exchange for money. And then about 8% are pimps, just pimps running around. This happened to one of my friends in Amsterdam. Pimp realized, that she was the same ethnicity as him, started talking to her in her native language, and offered her a job, and the implication was pretty clear that it would be prostitution, and she was 16 at the time. Obviously, pornographers run around and pretend that it's a modeling gig. Some of them are at least truthful, it's nude modeling, but they'd be like, it's tasteful, and I'm just scouting you because you have this special type, and this would be for a fetish magazine, yes, but it's tasteful, it's respectful, and whatever else they can do. And we pay well, and we really respect the models, and so that happens, obviously. And then about 5% happen by a colleague or a boss. So those women at work were at times being asked by somebody they worked with, which obviously, is a hostile work environment, and you would want to leave. And sometimes it was the boss, so all you can do is leave. We know that women who get sexually harassed or assaulted by colleagues or bosses rarely ever get any kind of justice. The best they can do is try and get out of there as fast as possible. Then we had about 4% customers, and I would wager that this is probably seems a little bit too low, or some of the strangers in the stranger category could be customers, because I've heard this from a lot of friends of mine. If you're a barmaid or just a regular waitress, or you're working, I'm not sure what the English term is for somebody who takes coats at conventions. In Germany, we call those hostesses, but I know that hostess has a prostitution connotation in some other countries. And it certainly does in the minds of a lot of men. A lot of, these rich, fancy businessmen going to conventions, business conventions, or business meetings, for them, a woman in a service job, a woman at any kind of checkout, a woman in any kind of, uniform, is a potential prostitute. And you can ask, do you want to come back to my hotel for this much money? Because they know these women aren't paying a lot. A lot of these women are part-timers, minimum wage, etc. And I've already mentioned the significant, small but significant number of taxi drivers who harass women in their taxis for prostitution. And then sometimes it is the boyfriend or the date who wants something sexually and realizes, yeah, I'm not going to get it unless I compensate, which is obviously really disgusting and upsetting. Or it's the wannabe pimp who's, honey, you're really cute and I don't know, my friend thinks so. Would you do it with him sometime? I guess they probably wrote her boundaries slightly slower than that. Or, you're so gorgeous, you can make a lot of money on OnlyFans. And he graciously offers to manage said OnlyFans. And then there were a few in the category of other, and that included, I think one was a driving instructor who said that instead of the payment that she would usually do for a driving lesson, she could pay with a blowjob. It also included 2 cases where one woman in prostitution, one woman in porn, tried to encourage another woman to enter. And these are the only scenarios where it was a woman approaching another woman. So 2 out of these 114 cases was a woman already in the sex trade trying to convince another one that it was a good idea. And that is obviously a thing that happens, and that can be extremely upsetting. And it's not harmless just because she's not saying, sell yourself to me or I'm going to be your pimp. It's still upsetting to hear this, and it is still harassment even when a woman does it, and even if that woman herself is sexually exploited, it's not okay. On the other hand, I do understand that the way the sex trade works, a lot of women, including women who are trafficked, are pushed to recruit others. It's a difficult space where you can be both victim and perpetrator in one, because in the extreme cases, this would be a pimped woman who, for example, is doing drugs, and she's doing drugs with other addicted women and girls, and she's suggesting that they could also make money through prostitution. So that's a thing that happens. Maybe a discussion for another time, but among these cases that were reported, that was a small number. I should say that several of these instances that were described, weren't just verbal. They included exhibitionism. They included men touching themselves while making their request. They included women being groped. And 2 cases involved physical assault, and one woman did describe that assault as rape when she refused to prostitute herself. Finally, I'm going to discuss a few excuses that men used to justify why they did that, and most of them don't need any justification. They don't have any conscious justification. It's just, all of it is entitlement. The world is my brothel, is the underlying philosophy. So a lot of them obviously would say, well, I didn't know she wasn't a prostitute. I thought she was one. What they base prostitute on is extremely flimsy. It's enough to be young and female. Not that there's any way to reliably identify who is in prostitution, because women in prostitution do generally look like other women. There aren't definitive markers. There are the tattoos that trafficking victims get, but there aren't any definitive markers. And women in prostitution don't all dress the same, or yes, there are higher rates of things like, obviously, certain types of clothing. There are higher rates of plastic surgery, but at this stage, plastic surgery is extremely normal in society. And yeah, the point is we all look the same. And whoever tries to put us into 2 categories is doing so erroneously. It's not possible, and it shouldn't be either. A lot of women were racially profiled, so the assumption was they were in prostitution because that man had encountered other women in prostitution. They happened to be of a certain race, and those would obviously usually not be white women, though it can sometimes be if you're assumed to be Eastern European, because a lot of sexually exploited women in the world are Eastern European. So it has happened to, like, for example, a white woman in an Asian majority country where she's assumed to be Russian or from another part of Eastern Europe. And then the assumption is she's in prostitution because a lot of men in those countries have never encountered a white woman other than in the prostitution and also the porn context. Yeah, in many places, this would mostly affect women of color. So Latina women experience this, who are obviously already associated, with hypersexuality in our culture. Same thing with Black women. That's a legacy of slavery that's very much alive, because sexual exploitation was historically a part of slavery, and there are still extremely, extremely strong remains of said dynamic. Yeah, a lot of Black women in Europe report that they still, especially women from places like Nigeria, where there's a lot of trafficking. Also, it can be country specific like that. And Asian women, obviously, because Asian women are trafficked all over the world. And a lot of the women who got harassed in this way were not women at all. They were teenagers. They were girls. Then there are the men who are trying to sell it to the woman as in, you'd make a lot of money. This would be a great career for you. And this is where all the media reporting that keeps telling us prostitution is so great. You're going to go buy a mansion, retire at 35, have all these rich, powerful men adore you and kiss your feet. Where all that bullshit that is going on in our culture with those narratives really helps those men make that case to women and girls. I'm doing this in your interest, and it's an acknowledgement of your beauty and your sex appeal, and it's how you're going to get powerful and happy and content and get ahead in life. And finally, there are the men guilt-tripping women about having lent her money or having done her a favor, and she thinks, this is a friend or at least a friendly stranger, and they mean well, but in his mind, she just accrued a debt, and it should be paid off through access to her body. That's the thing that happened to me, where somebody I thought was trustworthy paid for my bus ticket, which is completely normal. Me and friends, we do this all the time. Someone forgot cash and you pay for their ticket. But in his mind, he later said to me, I paid for that bus ticket that time, so why don't you want to have sex with me when I invested in you coming to visit me? Yeah, I'm laughing, but of course that was extremely upsetting. And I remember I shouted at him, look, I am not a prostitute, because I instantly got his way of thinking. And then he, pretended like that's not what he meant. Yeah, that's the thinking of a lot of men. I paid for her dinner, I paid for her bus ticket, I paid for whatever. Now she's mine and she owes me. And we are never, ever getting rid of that thinking while we are accepting an entire industry built around that notion that women accrue sexual debt to men if they accept anything of monetary value. But overall, it's not like you can avoid some things and you don't get harassed. This can happen to any woman. It's enough to be female, usually young or possibly a minor. And most of these men are acting on opportunity. They keep asking lots and lots of girls over and over again until 1 in 100 says yes, because she's cash strapped. Or maybe she really is a woman in the sex trade. It can happen to anybody, and we're delusional if we think it has nothing to do with us. And there's a quote by prostitution survivor Autumn Burris, and she says, prostitution is Me Too on steroids. And that refers mostly to the women in the sex trade. And in my activism, or you can see basically any other video on this channel, it's not about women like me who neither are nor have been in the sex trade. It's mostly about the women in it. They bear the brunt. But it does affect all of us. It can happen to any of us. And finally, maybe the most obvious point, any of us could end up slipping into the sex trade. Any of us, if we don't fight for a society that takes care of chronically ill people, disabled people, anyone who can't work or can't find work, if we don't bother to do that, we don't protect women from poverty when they are single moms, when they get older, when they have trauma and they can't work because due to that trauma, if we don't fight for that, any one of us could end up in the sex trade, including some middle-class women. It's more likely to happen to working-class women, but it can happen to middle-class women too. The fight against prostitution is for all our safety, for all of us to be respected. Prostitution is built on dividing women into groups and then have those groups fight each other. The woman at home and the woman in sex trade fighting each other. The woman who is higher level in prostitution looking down on the ones that are lower level, feeling like the one in the higher tier has made it and now she's spitting on them. So we're always pitted against each other, and never look at the men who are playing all of us. We have to really, really refuse the Madonna whore divide. And like I said, prostitution is the institutionalized Madonna whore divide. We are all in this together. This is why prostitution is every woman's business and every girl's business. And we're not going to shut up about it.